So this may be seen as old news, which I don't necessarily disagree with. In this world, 10 days ago could be seen as something from an eternity ago. But that's besides the point. If this guy ends up actually getting traded before this video is public on YouTube, then I'll make another video going out there and, retconning everything and going over the actual trade. But for right now, what I wanted to do was head over to Toronto, and an idea shared by Chris Johnston on a recent edition of The Chris Johnston Show. The Leafs Nation went out there and tweeted this out. It's an excerpt from Johnston's broadcast. We'll see whether or not defenseman Timothy Liljegren maybe still gets traded. I know he had just signed a 2-year extension with the Toronto Maple Leafs, but I don't think you can entirely rule out a trade in his circumstance yet. They're still going to keep chipping away at that roster. Yes, today we are talking about Timothy Liljegren, a guy who 2 weeks ago signed an extension to stay with the Toronto Maple Leafs, one that I think you could say was pretty worth it. I don't know, you be the judge. Liljegren is 25 years old, and he was a 17th overall pick by the Maple Leafs in 2017. The contract that he is on right now sees him making $3 million a year, for, of course, the next 2 seasons. Now, I'd say that the response was kind of mixed. I mean, there were some people going out there and talking about how Liljegren was scratched for certain parts over the past 2 postseasons. Now, of course, he did play the majority of the games for the Toronto Maple Leafs against the Boston Bruins this previous offseason, and then last year he did play some against the Lightning and the Panthers, but he hasn't really been an every single game, every single situation kind of guy. And at 25 years old, there is reason to believe that he's got the opportunity to turn himself around. $3 million for a player who can do what he does is not the worst thing in the world when you consider how good Liljegren can be. He was never supposed to be an offensive point producer. He was never supposed to be a flashy guy. He was always supposed to be a shutdown, defensively minded D-man. And that was always what the Leafs were expecting. It's just, when he doesn't really do that to the best of his ability, that's when you start to get annoyed and say, okay, well, if you're not defending well, then what else are you doing? Like, Timothy Liljegren has such a specified skill set that once that skill set goes awry a little bit, it becomes a lot more shaky to project where he goes. Now, for $3 million, you can say that that's a totally fine experiment, especially when you consider the circumstances of the Maple Leafs, but the fact that Liljegren is making $3 million and he is not the guy who is necessarily there yet opens the door to him potentially still being traded. And it's why we have been talking about the idea here in this video. It's why Chris Johnston went out there and said even that it could still be a possibility that Liljegren gets traded by the Toronto Maple Leafs. For all the reasons that we had talked about, his age, his projection, what he was supposed to be, and the skills he has, you could debate that there is good value there. And if a team was willing to be a little bit more patient with him, they weren't really so stingy like the Maple Leafs could be when developing these guys in this situation. The Maple Leafs are competitive now. They need to be at their best. Everybody needs to show up, and if you don't, you're going to get scratched. Because there's a capacity for guys like Liljegren who are not there yet to potentially be placed underneath others. You can say that if he was sent over to a team that was more lenient in that respect, it would be better for the player, it would be better for the Leafs if they traded him away and gave him that opportunity. Here's a comment made on the R Leafs subreddit that got a whole bunch of replies and upvotes from RJ Slim talking about Liljegren and his overall profile. This guy has been scratched 2 postseasons in a row in a very mediocre back end. He needs to be sheltered with offensive zone starts, but provides no offense. 1 assist in 13 playoff games. He was the only Leaf player to not post a shot in the Boston series. Even Simon Benoit had better advanced stats last year. Not everything, but something that was used to glorify Liljegren and ridicule Benny before this season. That's despite Benny starting a higher percentage of his shifts in the D zone than any other Leafs D, with Liljegren getting a higher percentage of offensive zone starts than anyone else aside from Timmins. Benoit also had more takeaways and fewer giveaways to add to that. Timothy Liljegren has no elite traits that would make him anything more than a replacement-level player. He's shown that he is the last player you should count on to rise to the occasion when it matters. I'm not sure how anyone could think he's even worth a guaranteed spot in our playoff lineup at this point, let alone at $3 million. Regardless, I can pretty much guarantee this is not something Treliving does, and I think it's more likely he's playing somewhere else next season. Trade him to Pittsburgh and let Dubas make that mistake. But of course, if you want to talk about guys who are on the team, guys who can fit in spots in the lineup, if you wanted to talk about replacements, I mean, Timothy Liljegren and his $3 million AAV salary is honestly not terrible. In fact, you could say it's pretty good in comparison to other players on the free agent market or elsewhere on the trade market who exhibit similar profiles. I say profiles including age, including projection, because when it comes to talent profiles, you can say that guys who are roughly around the same talent level of Liljegren right now, no matter the age, probably would get something in the $2.5–3 million range anyway. So where exactly would this allocation of the money and the assets go for Toronto? Well, it really depends what they would get back in return. If they're able to bolster up their forward core, get a little bit more depth in the middle there for their scoring, then I guess you could say it might be worthwhile if you wanted to think about that. The Maple Leafs are always looking for extra guys to contribute point production-wise, right? If you want to talk about guys who could replace the spot for Liljegren on D, there are a few guys that you could debate whether or not they could do that. I mean, Jake McCabe is still there. They got Oliver Ekman-Larsson in free agency. Tanev, of course, is a really big acquisition, and Joni Hakanpää is right there too. Now, he, of course, might not have the opportunity to play in the NHL anymore, depending on how that injury thing goes. Yeah, we're still kind of conflicted as to whether or not that's really going to work out in the ways that we thought. But there are enough names on the Toronto Maple Leafs blue line where if you were to trade away a Liljegren, you don't even need to get a defenseman back. You could potentially survive a season with those guys that are already there, thus opening the door as to whether or not a Liljegren trade is even possible. Honestly, I've always been a fan of Liljegren, even back in like 2018. Like, seriously, we were making videos about this guy back in that time frame, talking about his projection, how he was good for the regular BK in the SHL, and I was always a really big fan of his ever since he was drafted in the 2017 NHL Draft. But now, you think about it, if the Maple Leafs do decide to make a trade, they decide to pull the trigger, as Chris Johnston says they might be able to, it would ultimately signal the direction they're going down and what they plan for themselves in the next little while. And I say a little while as in literally in the very short-term future. If it gets to the point where they're trading Liljegren away, it's not because he's a bad player per se, it's because they need extra assets to help them out up front, or they have themselves a defenseman that is already better on the table on a trade as well. They need to go out there and do some damage, make the second round, make the third round, and prove to everybody that Toronto is no fluke, that their top-tier players can play, score, and win like top-tier players should be able to. Unfortunately, if they feel like a guy like Liljegren doesn't help them out in this year's worth of a season and the playoffs, then so be it. It's ultimately a discussion of where you want to put your assets and how you feel you're going to project into the next year. Not 2 years, not 3 years, the next year. In fact, before we end off this video, I wanted to refer back to some of the videos we used to make on this YouTube channel. Here's a video from 6 years ago. I believe this was during the 2017-18 season. Probably sometime at the end of the year, so let's say March-ish. When was this video published on YouTube? This was published on February 18th, 2018. Okay, so I was off by a few weeks there, but Chris Tanev is worth more than only Timothy Liljegren. That was the idea, and we were talking about the Canucks trading Tanev for Liljegren, who at the time was a, I think, near 19-year-old prospect, and he was good, and Chris Tanev was potentially getting traded to Toronto. He was always linked to Toronto for years. 6 years ago, we were still talking about Tanev and the Leafs, and now in 2024, it's finally going down after the Leafs were in on him from Calgary and the trade rumors earlier this year, and then they acquired him after he had gotten traded to Dallas and didn't re-sign there. It's kind of funny how everything goes full circle. Now Liljegren and Tanev are on the same team. Either way, though, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below about the Toronto Maple Leafs potentially making another trade with this player. We're not talking about Nicholas Robertson yet. We're not talking about Mitch Marner. This time, we've been talking about him a lot over the past few weeks, but in this video I wanted to focus on Liljegren and his situation. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Do you think he gets traded? If he does get traded by the time this video is uploaded on YouTube, then hey, I apologize for that. But thoughts in the comment section as to how he's played. Do you think he gets traded and where to? What's the cost and what do the Leafs get? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed this video. Sign on and bye.